Hi, guys. So, I don't know what week of quarantine we're in, but we're still doing it. I hope you're doing well. I miss you guys. I was super impressed with your summaries from last week, and I did have a few people ask me to keep recording the videos of the reading and kind of explaining what's going on, so I'm happy to do that. I wish we were in person. Sorry, y'all. Allergies. I wish we were in person. I wish I could see you. I do miss being in class with you guys, but we're going to make the best of a bad situation. So, our assignment for this week is to read chapters 3 and 4, and then you guys have a quiz on chapters 1 through 4. So, as long as you're following along and taking your time, you should do really well. The summaries were really good, like I said, and it showed that you guys were holding on to key points. So that's really awesome. I'm super proud. So we're going to start with chapter 3. It's called Life in Stamps. And it says, the difference between a southern town and a northern town must be the experiences of childhood. Heroes and enemies are first met, and values and dislikes are first learned and labeled in the early environment. Mr. McElroy, who lived in the big house next to the store, was very tall and broad. He was the only Negro I knew except for the school principal and the visiting teachers who wore matching pants and jacket. He never laughed, seldom smiled, and he liked to talk to Uncle Willie. He never went to church, which Bailey and I thought also proved he was a very courageous person. How great it would be to grow up like that, to be able to ignore religion, especially living next door to a woman like Mama. I watched him with the excitement of expecting him to do anything at any time. I never tired of this or became disappointed with him. There seemed to be an understanding between Mr. McElroy and Grandmother. This was obvious to us because he never chased us off his land. In summer's late sunshine, I often sat under the tree in his yard, surrounded by the bitter smell of its fruit and the sound of flies that fed on the berries. He sat in a swing on his porch, rocking in his brown three-piece suit. One greeting a day was all you could expect from Mr. McElroy. After his good morning, child, or good afternoon, child, he never said a word. Even if I met him again on the road in front of his house or down by the well, or ran into him behind the house escaping in a game of hide and seek, he remained a mystery of my childhood. A man who owned his land in the big many-windowed house with a porch that went all the way around the house, an independent black man, a rare occurrence in stamps. So that's important because she's acknowledging that there is this very clear divide between black and white people. She's acknowledging that black people are not in a position to do as well or to own property or to be successful. And she knows that from a young age. And Mr. McElroy is an example of that. He's an example of what we call an anomaly, someone who doesn't meet the standard. He has beat the odds. And her grandmother has beat the odds, and we're going to find out how. Bailey was the greatest person in the world, and the fact that he was my brother, my only brother, and I had no sisters to share him with, was such a good fortune that it made me want to live a Christian life just to show God that I was grateful. I was big, elbowy, and rough, but he was small, graceful, and smooth. I was described by our friends as being brown, but he was praised for his dark black skin. His hair fell down in black curls, and my head was covered in tight, kinky curls, but he loved me. When adults said unkind things about my features, my family's good looks were painful to me. Bailey would look at me from across the room, and I knew that it was just a matter of time before he would take revenge. He would allow the old ladies to finish wondering where my features came from. Then he would ask in a voice like cooling bacon grease, "Oh, Mrs. Coleman, how is your son? I saw him the other day, and he looked sick enough to die." Astonished, the ladies would ask, "Die? From what? He ain't sick." And in a voice oilier than the one before, he'd answer with no expression on his face, "From the uglies." I would hold my laugh, bite my tongue, and very seriously remove even the slightest smile from my face. Later, behind the house, we'd laugh and laugh. Bailey could be sure of very few punishments for his frequent offensive behavior, because he was the pride of the Henderson Johnson family. His movements were carefully calculated. He was able to find more hours in the day than I thought existed. He finished his chores, his homework, read more books than I, and played games on the side of the hill with the other children. He could even pray out loud in church, and was skilled at stealing candy from the barrel that sat under the fruit counter and Uncle Willie's nose. Of all the needs, there are none imaginary. A lonely child has the one that must be satisfied if there's going to be hope, and a hope of wholeness is the unshaking need for an unshakable God. My pretty black brother was mine. So that part, she's talking about how important Bailey is to her and how he's really her protector. He looks out for her, and they truly are the best of friends. And that relationship has molded her and made her who she is, and she knows that. In Stamps, the custom was to can everything that could possibly be preserved. All the neighbors helped each other to kill pigs. The ladies of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church helped Mama prepare the pork for sausage. They squeezed their fat arms elbow deep in a cup up meat, mixed it, and gave a small taste to all obedient children who brought wood for the black stove. The men cut off the larger pieces of meat and laid them in the smokehouse to begin the preservation process. Throughout the year until the next frost, we took our meals from the smokehouse, the little garden close to the store, and the shelves of canned food. About at least twice yearly, Mama would feel that as children we should have fresh meat included in our diets. We were then given money, pennies, nickels, and dimes handed to Bailey and sent to town to buy some. Since the whites had refrigerators, their stores brought meat from Texarkana and sold it to the wealthy even in the peak of summer. Crossing the black area of Stamps with a child, which to a child seemed a whole world, we were expected to stop and speak to every person we met, and Bailey felt that he had to spend a few minutes playing with each friend. There was a joy in going to town with money in our pockets. Bailey's pockets were as good as my own, and plenty of time. But the pleasure left us when we reached the white part of town. In Stamps, the segregation was so complete that most black children didn't really absolutely know what whites looked like. We knew only that they were different, to be feared, and that fear was included the hostility of the powerless against the powerful, the poor against the rich, the worker against the employer, and the poorly dressed against the well-dressed. I remember never believing that whites were really real. I couldn't force myself to think of them as people. People were Miss LeGrone, Miss Hendricks, Mama, Little B, and Louise and Rex. White folks couldn't be people because their feet were too small, their skin too white, and they didn't walk on their flat feet the way people did. They walked on their heels like horses. People were those who lived on my side of the town. I didn't like them all, or, in fact, any of them very much, but they were people. These other strange pale creatures weren't considered folks. They were white folks. So that's really important too, because she is telling us that there's such a divide and such a separation that she doesn't even see white people as people. She doesn't think that they're anywhere near on her level. And of course, we know that's not true, but that's her thought process. That's the way that she perceives the world. So chapter 4 is called Mama. You shall not be dirty, and you should not be impudent, were the 2 commandments of Grandmother Henderson by which we lived. Impudent means rude, disrespectful. So Mama's got 2 rules. You should not be dirty and you should not be impudent. I'll start over. You shall not be dirty and you shall not be impudent were the 2 commandments of Grandmother Henderson by which we lived. Each night in the bittersweet winter, we were forced to wash faces, arms, necks, legs, and feet before going to bed. We would go to the well and wash in the ice-cold, clear water, grease our legs, and walk carefully into the house. We wiped the dust from our toes and settled down for schoolwork, cornbread, milk, prayers, and bed, always in that order. Mama was famous for pulling the blankets off after we had fallen asleep to examine our feet. If they weren't clean enough for her, she took the stick, she kept one behind the door for emergencies, and woke up the offender with a few well-placed burning reminders. She made sure we learned the importance of cleanliness. Politeness was also important. Impudent children were hated by God and ashamed to its parents and could bring ruin to its house and family. All adults had to be addressed as Mr., Mrs., or Miss. Everyone I knew respected these customary laws except for the poor white trash children. Some families of poor white trash lived on Mama's farm land behind the school. Sometimes a group of them came to the store. They called my uncle by his first name and ordered him around the store. He, to my shame, obeyed them. My grandmother, too, followed their orders, except that she didn't like to seem like a servant because she anticipated their needs. Here's sugar, Miss Potter, and here's baking powder. You didn't buy baking soda last month. You'll probably be needing some. Mama always directed her statements to the adults, but sometimes the dirty girls would answer, "No, Annie," they said, to Mama, who owned the land they lived on, who forgot more than they would ever learn. "Just give us some extra crackers and some more fish." At least they never looked her in the face, or I never caught them doing so. Nobody with any training at all would look right in a grown person's face. It meant the person was trying to take the words out before they were formed. The dirty little children didn't do that, but they threw their orders around the store like strikes of a whip. When I was around 10 years old, those children caused me the most painful and confusing experience I had ever had with my grandmother. One summer morning, after I had swept the dirt yard of leaves, gum wrappers, and Vienna sausage can labels, I swept the yellow dirt and made half moons carefully so that the design was clear. Then I went behind the store, came through the back of the house, and found grandmother on the front porch in her big white apron. Mama was admiring the yard, so I joined her. She didn't say anything, but I knew she liked it. She looked over toward the school principal's house and to the right at Mr. McElroy's. She was hoping one of those important people would see the design from the day's business it wiped out. Then she looked upward to the school. My head had swung with hers, so at just about the same time we saw a group of poor white trash kids marching over the hill and down by the side of the school. I looked at Mama for direction. She stood straight and began to sing quietly. She didn't look at me again. When the children reached halfway down the hill, halfway to the store, she said without turning, "Sister, go on inside." I wanted to beg her, "Mama, don't wait for them. Come on inside with me. If they come in the store, you go to the bathroom and let me serve them. They only frighten me if you're around. Alone, I know how to handle them." But of course I couldn't say anything, so I went in and stood behind the screen door. Before the girls got to the porch, I heard their laughter. I suppose my lifelong distrust was born in those cold, slow minutes. They finally came to stand on the ground in front of Mama. One of them folded her arms, pushed out her mouth, and started to sing quietly. I realized that she was imitating my grandmother. Another said, "No, Helen, you ain't standing like her. This is it." Then she lifted her chest and folded her arms, copying that strange way of standing that was Annie Henderson. Another laughed. "No, you can't do it. Your mouth ain't pushed out enough. It's like this." I thought about the rifle behind the door, but I knew I'd never be able to hold it straight. Or our other gun that was locked in the trunk, and Uncle Willie had the key on his chain. Through the screen door, I could see that the arms of Mama's apron shook with her singing, but her knees seemed to have locked as if they would never bend again. She sang on, no louder than before, but no softer either, no slower or faster. The girls had tired of imitating Mama and turned to other ways to make her respond. One crossed her eyes, stuck her thumbs in both sides of her mouth, and said, "Look here, Annie." Grandmother sang on, and the apron strings trembled. I wanted to throw a handful of black pepper in their faces to scream that they were dirty, but I knew I couldn't do anything. One of the smaller girls did a kind of dance while the others laughed at her, but the tall one, who was almost a woman, said something very quietly, which I couldn't hear. They all moved backward from the porch, still watching Mama. For an awful second, I thought they were going to throw a rock at Mama, who seemed, except for her apron strings, to have turned into stone herself. But the big girl turned her back, bent down, and put her hands flat on the ground. She didn't pick anything up. She did it just a handstand. Her dirty bare feet and long legs went straight for the sky. Her dress fell down around her shoulders, and she had on no underpants. She hung like that for only a few seconds, then fell. Mama changed her song to a religious song. I found that I was praying too. How long could Mama continue? What would they think of to do to her next? Would I be able to stay out of it? What would Mama really like me to do? Then they were moving out of the yard, on their way to town. They nodded their heads and shook their thin behinds and turned one at a time. "Bye, Annie. Bye, Annie. Bye, Annie." Mama never turned her head or unfolded her arms, but she stopped singing and said, "Bye, Miss Helen. Bye, Miss Ruth. Bye, Miss Eloise." I burst. How could Mama call them Miss? The mean, nasty things. Why couldn't she have just come inside the sweet, cool store when we saw them come in over the hill? What did she prove? And then, if they were dirty, mean, and impudent, why did Mama have to call them Miss? She stood there for another whole song and then opened the screen door to look down on me, crying in anger. She looked until I looked up. Her face was a brown moon that shone on me. She was beautiful. Something had happened out there which I couldn't completely understand, but I could see that she was happy. Then she bent down and touched me, and I grew quiet. Go wash your face, sister. And she went behind the candy counter and sang, Glory, glory, praise the Lord. I threw the well water on my face and used the weekly handkerchief to blow my nose. Whatever the contest had been, I knew Mama had won. I went back to the front yard. Footprints were easy to sweep away. I worked for a long time on my new design. When I came back in the store, I took Mama's hand and we both walked outside to look at the new pattern. It was a large heart with lots of hearts growing smaller inside, and going from the outside edge of the smallest heart was an arrow. Mama said, Sister, that's very pretty. Then she turned back to the store and continued, Glory, glory, praise the Lord, when I lay my burden down. So what we see here is that her grandmother is very strong and a very faithful woman. And although she's been incredibly disrespected, she holds true to who she is. In her mind, she can't control those kids, but she can control how she reacts. And she knows that if she reacts poorly and gets in their face and gets nasty, that there could be some repercussions for that because of who she is and because she is a black woman. And these are white kids. They might be poor white trash, but they're still white kids. So what she's doing is she's making sure she's going to hold true to herself and stay calm and steadfast. And she's not going to give them the satisfaction of responding. And they did eventually leave. They disrespected her, but she didn't lose herself and she continued to be respectful to them. People spoke of Mama as a good-looking woman, and some who remembered her youth said she used to be very pretty. I saw only her power and strength. She was taller than any woman in my personal world, and her hands were so large they could reach around my head from ear to ear. Her voice was soft only because she chose to keep it so. In church, when she was asked to lead the singing, the sound would pour over the listeners and fill the air. Mama intended to teach Bailey and me to use the paths of life that she and people of her age and all the Negroes gone before had found, and found to be safe ones. She didn't agree with the idea that white folks could be talked to at all without risking one's life, and certainly they couldn't be spoken to impudently. In fact, even in their absence, they could not be spoken to badly unless we used the reference they. If she had been asked and had chosen to answer the question of whether she was cowardly or not, she would have said that she believed in reality. Didn't she stand up to them year after year? Wasn't she the only Negro and woman in stamps referred to as Mrs.? Some years before Bailey and I arrived in town, a man was hunted for assaulting a white woman. In trying to escape, he ran to the store. Mama and Uncle Willie hid him behind the dresser until night, gave him supplies for an overland journey, and sent him on his way. He was, however, caught, and in court, when he was questioned about his movements on the day of the crime, he replied that he had heard that he was being sought and hid in Mrs. Henderson's store. The judge asked that Mrs. Henderson appear in court, and when Mama arrived and said that she was Mrs. Henderson, the judge and other whites in the audience laughed. The judge had really made a mistake calling a Negro woman Mrs., but he was from Pine Bluff and couldn't have been expected to know that a woman who owned a store in the village would also be colored. The whites laughed about the incident for a long time, and the Negroes thought it proved the worth and honor of my grandmother. People on stamps used to say that the whites in our town were so prejudiced that a Negro couldn't buy white ice cream, except on July 4th. Other days he had to be satisfied with chocolate. A curtain had been drawn between the black community and all things white, but one could see through it enough to develop fear, admiration, and contempt for the white things. White folks' cars and white houses and their children and their women, but above all, their wealth that allowed them to waste was the most enviable. They had so many clothes that they were able to give away perfectly good dresses, faded just under the arms, to the sewing class at our school for the larger girls to practice on. I couldn't understand whites and where they got the right to spend money so freely. Of course, I knew God was white too, but no one could have made me believe that he was prejudiced. My grandmother had more money than all the poor white trash. We owned land and houses, but each day Bailey and I were reminded, waste not, want not. Mama bought 2 rolls of cloth each year for winter and summer clothes. She made my school dresses and handkerchiefs, Bailey's shirts and shorts, her aprons and house dresses from these. Uncle Willie was the only person in the family who wore ready-to-wear clothes all the time. Each day he wore fresh white shirts, and his special shoes cost $20. I thought Uncle Willie was sinfully proud, especially when I had to iron 7 shirts. So, I ask you guys in the quiz why Uncle Willie wears ready-to-wear clothes, and the reality is he probably does it because it's easier to fit his body. Remember, he has some physical deformities because of the accident he suffered as a baby. So it is possible that the reason why he wore ready-to-wear clothes is because they fit him better. The other reason that you could go with is that he is an adult man. You know, maybe he decided that he doesn't want his mother making his clothes, and Mama is okay with that, and so she makes the kids' clothes in her own, and Willie spends his money other ways. So those are 2 examples of why. But that brings us to the end of chapter 4. If you guys have any questions, you should email me, video chat me, whatever it takes, and we'll keep in touch, okay? Bye, guys.